to introduce to you today is sort of a rainy Friday. This is John Dorgan. He's a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, just down the road a little bit. He's been a friend of our department for quite a long time and had really strong ties. Sort of the lead director, I believe, C2V2.
Yeah, site director, right? Yeah, site director.
So ties with Ken and the other Colorado institutions from C2V2 all along. And most recently, he's now had a major role. I'm going to get the name right because I always think of it.
Yeah, it's tough.
And they just started. It's what's the? Is it
called
fair to give a dollar amount?
Oh, yeah, something on the order of $200 million.
$200 million grant that involves 122 companies, nonprofits, universities across the nation, including some in Colorado, particularly John. But it's the Institute for Advanced Composite Manufacturing Innovation, and that's been a huge, really an incredible recent advance in our ability to look at composites here in Colorado. John's been a huge part of that. So a little bit of his history. He got his, your PhD was at?
Right.
Yeah. So he actually did his undergraduate in chemical engineering at UMass Amherst, and then went out to Berkeley, got his PhD. Fantastic postdoc, Max Planck Institute.
It's a good place.
And, spent a couple years there, and then started at the Colorado School of Mines.
Just last year, I'm like 25.
Last year.
1993.
Not quite 20 years ago, like that.
Yeah. 21 years ago.
Okay. So with great pleasure, he's been working in all kinds of green chemistry, in particular sustainable polymer type solutions that don't involve necessarily fossil fuel as the starting point, and he's going to tell us all about that today. So.
Well, thank you, Travis. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm really pleased to be back here among my friends at Colorado State University. It has been a number of years since I was here to give seminar, although I'm in regular contact with many people here on campus. And Travis was kind enough to mention IACME is the acronym, the Institute for Advanced Manufacturing of Composites Innovation. And I won't talk about anything because it's just kicking off now. I mean, the money's supposed to start on June 1st or something like that. And I wish I could tell you that full $200 million was coming to me, but of course it's spread across 10 different states. And certainly your colleague in mechanical engineering, Don Radford, is an equal partner in that activity, looking at composites manufacturing. So in my talk today, I'll talk more about biomanufacturing. I want to acknowledge my graduate students, though. Here we are at the end of the semester, just a few days ago. And if you've been through Golden, you may have noticed South Table Mountain. It's sort of that iconic big rock-type structure. It looks like it's called a Castle Rock. And we sort of have a tradition in my group at the end of the semester. We always hike to the top of there. And so these are the people in my group right now. Nick Rohrer. Nick's actually working at NREL now full-time. Dylan Cousins is a first-year graduate student to my left, and then Chris Moran, who's a second-year student. And everybody is working on bio-based or renewable materials in the group these days. The work that I'll talk about throughout the talk, really, though, was done by the people that are not pictured here. Dr. Birgit Brown, who's now at Dow Chemicals in Houston. Professor Meg Sopkowitz-Klein, she's now on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And Dr. Bo Liu, who also coincidentally has moved now to Dow Chemicals in Houston and is working on polyolefins. And I should say that much of the work was supported by the USDA, but we've also had NSF and EPA support for the work. And so I will be a bit maybe introductory at the beginning, and I hope I don't bore people with that. But I did want to give sort of a survey maybe of bioplastics for the benefit of the students to really hopefully impress upon you just how vibrant this field really has become in recent years. And just as, you know, there's the big composites center that was funded, there's an equivalent program now that's coming online and should be equal in its magnitude, another $200 million or so in so-called biomanufacturing. And so I've titled my talk there, and we think that we're going to be collaborating with Colorado State University in that area, along with the National Renewable Energy Lab. if you want more details on some of the overview here, I can certainly make this available to you. But there's really a lot of stuff going on in terms of making new materials using biotechnology roots. But I always like to point out to people, it's sort of almost a back to the future type thing. I mean, if you look at how the polymer industry started, they really started with cellulose. So sort of the original bioplastic was a renewable material, and we just learned to do chemical modifications on that. Also, natural rubbers are a very important material from a global perspective. If you've ever flown in an airplane, you've taken advantage of natural rubber because it has very good properties for stopping the airplane. So all of the airplane tires are actually made largely from natural rubber. It has some superior mechanical properties compared to other things. So, again, on sort of the introductory side, what's driving some of this interest in bioplastics? Well, there's a field that's emerged maybe in the last couple of decades, industrial ecology. And the idea in industrial ecology is, can we actually bring together synthetic systems or industrial systems, but ones which mimic nature. And in particular, they mimic nature in terms of their ability to recycle nutrients and to reuse different feedstocks. And so if we look at that from sort of a different perspective, we can see coming down sort of the right-hand side here, if we're looking at, say, balancing carbon, if for carbon emissions, greenhouse warming issues, you can think about indirect sequestration, and certainly here at Colorado State University, people working in agricultural sciences, people working in forestry would be heavily involved with these types of approaches. What's the right land use policies to have? How do we do reforestation? Those types of things. If we look at my own campus for direct sequestration, so that's where we do carbon capture maybe from a coal-fired power plant, and let's pump that down into the ground, take advantage of what we know about subsurface physics, and see if we can't keep the carbon dioxide down in the ground. And then sort of the bioplastics is sort of this third leg of the industrial ecology approach to managing carbon. Can we tie up carbon from the atmosphere into things that we actually use, or can we recycle the carbon from the atmosphere through useful products? And so that the recycling idea here is shown in this schematic, which I've taken from Richard Gross's work. Oftentimes in industrial ecology, you're doing what's called a life cycle analysis. So those of you that are chemical engineers, it's really just a sophisticated mass and energy balance, right? And we take into account, what are the emissions associated with this? And so oftentimes people will talk about a life cycle analysis as sort of a birth to death or cradle to grave type of analysis. So, you become interested in what's the end of life sort of outcome of the materials that you're using. So that might be sort of a Western perspective on it, is a cradle to death. I like my colleague Ramani Narayan at Michigan State University. He calls this birth to reincarnation. Okay, so if you're doing bioplastics, you don't do cradle to grave, you do birth to reincarnation. And the reason for that is because if we have materials which will break down and degrade into carbon dioxide, but the carbon dioxide is being trapped by plants to provide our feedstocks for our bioplastics, then you really do close that loop. And so this is sort of the industrial ecology perspective. We make a synthetic system, but it mimics nature's ability because, when you grow a plant, it sheds its leaves, the leaves decay, they provide some nutrients to the soil, but they largely become carbon dioxide again. So we have that birth to reincarnation type of perspective. And then, of course, I've already had some wonderful talks here in the department about just fantastic work going on using biotechnology. And I think that really we see just tremendous improvements in biotechnological approaches. Some years ago, I collaborated with somebody in our own sort of environmental science department to write a sort of a state of the survey, a survey of the state of the science at that time. But it's certainly moved dramatically since then with inexpensive sequencing. And then, of course, I'm trained as a polymer chemist, polymer physicist, polymer engineer. And we were nano before nano was cool, right? And that is, we're always working sort of at that nanoscopic type of length scales. And so the argument that I'm putting forward is that really we're looking in the bioplastics regime, at least, of these things all coming together. Okay, and so they're all influencing one another. We're better and better at the sort of traditional polymer science stuff. So we have new chemistries where we can convert different types of monomers, but those monomers are becoming increasingly available from different types of feedstocks, predominantly from renewable feedstocks. And then of course we're always motivated by this idea of how do we actually balance the ecology for the materials that we use. Okay, so let's look at this then in a little more detail. And really what I like to think about bioplastics the way that Yoshi Doi from the Riken Institute taught me to think about it. And that is, we can think of it in terms of how many stages. So the stages here are the same as the number of arrows in my diagram. And so I've been involved with polylactide, and that's sort of a generation 1 type of bioplastic. So in this case, the carbon dioxide is fixed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, but we have a plant material that we can convert into sugars. So we go to sugars and then do fermentation to make our monomer, and then we do more traditional type of chemical engineering to make the polymer material. That can be simplified. You can think about just going to sort of 2-stage. So the obvious thing to think about here is just going to something like soy oil. So you go directly to oil in the plants, and soy oil itself can be reacted in a number of different ways to make useful materials, thermosets and other things. And then, again, on that theme of back to the future, if we look, there are people doing work now where we can go directly in plants to make different types of useful materials. But of course, we've been doing that for a long time because I think you're all sitting at sort of wood tables, right? And so the original bioplastic is very much back in vogue. Okay, so I was fortunate enough when I started as an assistant professor to get tapped in with people that were interested in making polylactides, and that really blew up, and it became commercial technology. And now when you look around, you'll find all kinds of stuff made out of polylactides. And fortunately, one of the things that's made out of polylactides is the iTunes gift card. And the reason that that's fortunate is because I have a teenage daughter, and so she can actually relate somewhat to what I go off to do each day in terms of what is this bioplastic stuff, what's that all about? And I can say, well, it's what the iTunes card is made out of, and so then all of a sudden Dad's cool. Not too cool. Good point. Yeah. And so, if we look here, I mean, this is sort of just an overview, but the idea is, we have starch, we make sugar, we do a fermentation, we make lactic acid. And the reason I think PLA was such a home run is that if you look at the fermentation to lactic acid, it's a very efficient fermentation. It goes to 99+%. But of course, lactic acid itself, you can't polymerize. So that's a good stop and ask a question. Anybody know why it's so difficult to polymerize lactic acid? See, if we were in chemistry, everybody would know the answer. Chemical engineers should know the answer. Okay, it's a secondary alcohol, so it's not as reactive as a primary alcohol. So instead what you do is you make a ring structure, you make an LL lactide structure, and if you do the ring opening polymerization, you get to very high molecular weight. So you're limited if you just try to condense lactic acid to relatively low molecular weight. And this is a place where stereochemistry really comes into play. And again, for natural systems, usually we're talking about the L enantiomers, and so L-lactic acid is what's typically made. So you end up with the LL lactide predominantly, but these are produced by reactive distillation. So depending on how you run your reactive distillation, you can actually do some racemization and get some LD lactide as well. Now, more recently, genetic organisms have been created so you can make the D lactic acid. Okay, and so then you can go to DD lactic acid. And that stereochemistry will come back later in my talk. But the point is that, if you think about just crystallization, so how much crystallinity can you get in a polymer, stereochemistry is important. So if you have, very pure all LL lactide, you can get to fairly high amounts of crystallinity. Once you put about 20% of the D in there in a random way, the material will be completely amorphous. So that, this is one of the things that's really beautiful, I think, about industrial biotechnology and polymer science, is that one of the things that biology gives you is exquisite control over stereochemistry. And so it really plays an important role, I think, in terms of what we're able to do. Well, there's the plant. So, one of the original biorefineries. It's in Blair, Nebraska. Uses corn as the feedstock, and they make about 300 million pounds per year of polylactide at this point. As I said, from an industrial ecology perspective, you can do these life cycle analysis studies, and you can show in a very quantitative way that the environmental impact of making your polymers this way is much reduced compared to petroleum-sourced polymers. And that's true in this case. I don't want to, be labeled as a zealot, though. There are some other things I might talk about it in a few slides. But for instance, you can also make polyethylene by taking ethanol, doing a dehydration to make ethylene, and then polymerizing to make polyethylene. So you can make a completely renewable polyethylene. I'm skeptical that if you go through all the steps that it takes to make ethanol and the energy, and then you make polyethylene from it, that really beats making it from clean natural gas type of source. So, and that's exactly one of the points I'm trying to make, is that you can't rely on your emotion to say, well, renewable resources are good, and so this is necessarily better. And industrial ecology and the life cycle analysis tools that we have is the right way to look at that. That's the engineering way to look at it. That's the quantitative way to look at things. I'm sure you guys have actually come into contact with PLA. I'd be shocked at this point. It's been around for 10 years or something, and as college students, you probably have seen the green stripe, beer cups, and that's one of the ways that you might come into contact with it. But you can make, nice fibers, so bedding's made out of it, candy wrappers. You'll see it in the grocery store, particularly in organic foods type of grocery stores. It's widely used these days. And of course, here's the great advantage. If we look at this cup over a period of time in a composting environment, it will actually break down. And I should say that, again, there is an end-of-life issue associated with the use of bioplastics. And that is, it's great, if PLA ends up in a composting environment, right? In Golden, Colorado, we have curbside recycling, okay? We do not have curbside compost pickup, okay? So, there's an issue here with, if the polylactide ends up in a landfill, okay, and it is degradable, what will it degrade to under anaerobic conditions? Another chemical engineering question, right? Biological engineering question, right? Methane, okay? So you don't really want to be emitting methane to the atmosphere. Now, in a modern landfill in the United States, of course, we collect that methane and we flare it. But still, the end of life makes a difference here, right? And that's something that is a real controversy in bioplastics is, hey, well, you're saying this stuff is so great, but if it ends up in the landfill, how great really is it? And, so there's an infrastructure issue associated with this. And I think one of the places where this really does make sense is in a large venue. So, say Disneyland, only used biodegradable food packaging, or if every, McDonald's and Burger King, where they have sort of a captive stream, everything's coming in together, and particularly when it's mixed with food waste, then it really makes a lot of sense. And so, not to favor the CU Buffs over the CSU Rams, but at Folsom Field, at least, they do require that, I know. And so when your new football stadium comes online here, maybe some of you can be activists and convince them that they should also have all renewable, all biodegradable food packaging to be used with that. And again, just a couple other sort of survey ideas here. I'm sure you maybe have come into contact with these plant bottles. So Coca-Cola, Heinz Ketchup uses this too, the Heinz Ketchup bottles. And what's going on there is you're making polyethylene terephthalate. The structure is shown there. But as I alluded to before, you can take ethanol to ethylene by doing dehydrolysis, but you can also go to ethylene glycol by doing a partial oxidation reaction. And so in the Coca-Cola technology, they just make that block, or that repeat unit, structural unit, more appropriately, from ethanol. Okay, and so that's another nice example of these materials. Well, you're making PET. It's just a drop-in replacement. So you take ethanol to ethylene glycol. So this is just a drop-in replacement. It's just that the ethylene glycol is coming from ethanol. So this is just your traditional PET. There are other there's work on furan-based polymers where they're trying to replace the terephthalic acid with a furan material from renewable resources, and that may be what you're thinking of, because then the permeability is not as good. So, there's an arms race on. All kinds of biotechnology companies are out there, different types of routes to get to renewable terephthalic acid, because both Coke and Pepsi have made a commitment to go to 100% renewable PET when it's available. And so, if you have a particular biotechnology, this is great target molecule to think about making. And there are many people thinking about it now. And it's really a great paradigm. I don't know how many of you know, but in plastics, when you see the little recycling mark on the plastic article, that's actually listed by economic value. So the number 1 means it's the most valuable, and so therefore the most recycled, and that's PET. Okay, and so we're up to almost 30% of the PET that's sold actually ends up being recycled, which is great. And so if you think about this paradigm, right? Now, if we were to make PET from renewable resources and we got the recycling rate up, right? Instead of depleting resources, you'd actually be accumulating a pool of PET for future generations to use. And so I think, from an industrial ecology perspective, if we can move towards that type of paradigm, it'd just be fantastic. It'd be fantastic. Other things that have gone on, I mentioned already, in Generation 2, this is a schematic from Richard Wool's, the late Richard Wool's textbook here, where he talks about all of the different things that you can do with soybean oil. And down here, what I have is a distribution of fatty acids. I apologize, it's really too small to read. But again, it shows the interplay between sort of nanotechnology, polymer science, and biotechnology. Because what we're looking at is the distribution of all the different fatty acids as a function of the crop. Okay, so this is canola, cottonseed, linseed. By the way, linseed, biocomposites, linoleum, old-fashioned linoleum comes from linseed. And then over here, there's a high oleic material. And you can see in this, the plant's been genetically engineered to give you 83% of the oleic fatty acid, which of course is the one that's useful for making different type of polymer materials. So that's a nice example of the interplay. There was really a fantastic accomplishment, industrial accomplishment, via joint venture between Genacor and Goodyear. And here, those of you that are doing metabolic engineering will know about the isoprene pathway. And so that isoprene pathway is the one that leads to polycis isoprene, which is natural rubber. But it's present in all kinds of different plants. And they were able to take the genes from the plants and express them into microbes and actually do large-scale fermentation. The nice thing here is isoprene is a gas, so the separations are very simple. The gas just comes off of the fermentation. And so they've been able to take this and actually put it into tires. And so they have materials here. And so it's a little bit weird because now we sort of have synthetically derived but renewably resourced natural rubber. So, we used to think about natural rubber and synthetic rubber, but now we can synthetically make natural rubber. So, it starts to get a little bit weird. Many of you maybe know about polyhydroxyalkanoates. This is just a case where the bacteria, instead of putting on fat, instead of having fat, like those of us that are middle-aged, for their energy reserves, instead they make a polyester, and then they can hydrolyze that polyester and get the monomers as a food source. And these have been known for a long time, but have only recently been commercialized. And so that's sort of Generation 2. And here this is from a collaboration I have now with Greg Beckham at NREL. And I sort of call this Generation 2.5 because it shows you again how things are changing. Because Yoshi Doi was one of the really big names, probably the most preeminent Japanese scientist in renewable polymers. This doesn't fit into his categories, okay? And why is that? The title of this paper was in Proceedings of the National Academy is lignin valorization, okay? And so making lignin valuable. And so if you think about cellulosic biorefining now, you have your lignocellulosics. The ligno part is the lignin. You separate that out. And then you hydrolyze your cellulosics to sugars, which you can ferment. And everybody thinks is struggling with what do we do with the lignin. In typical pulp and paper processing, it's just burned for energy recovery. But if you can make it valuable, then it's very interesting. And so here they've done metabolic engineering in order to make organisms which will actually eat lignin, okay, and convert it. And so in this case, they're funneling it through a particular pathway, and they can make all kinds of interesting stuff. Here's some of the structures that they're able to make. And of course, succinic acid is a sort of a platform type chemical. You can do catalysis on it and make butane diol. And if you put those two together, you're reacting an acid with an alcohol to make a polyester, and that polyester is actually called PBS, or polybutylene succinate. And actually there's a company that has a succinic acid platform called BioAmber that already is commercially producing 100% renewable PBS. And you probably don't know if you're not a polymer person, but as of January 1st, California has banned across the state the use of non-biodegradable or non-degradable plastic bags. So there's a market of 30 million Americans who are used to using plastic bags that no longer can. So if you can develop one of these materials for plastic bag applications, and PBS is a nice film material, it's a tremendous economic and environmental opportunity. The interesting thing about the lignin work is they're actually able to make muconic acid, and so it has double bonds in the backbone. So now we can put that into the polyester structure and have real functionality. There's reactive functionality in there, so you can imagine making cross-linkable materials or somehow otherwise functionalizing those double bonds through a wide variety of chemistries. And so I think my student Nick probably has made that polymer either yesterday or today, the PBS co-muconic acid. And then, of course, the final part here is what we're really just expressing genes in plants and making biopolymers directly. Of course, I have already mentioned that sort of wood is the original bioplastic. Starch is also used in food packaging applications. And then this is what we're talking about, is taking the genes from those microorganisms, expressing them in plants. Okay, in this case it's a switchgrass, and then here's the distribution, so percent dry weight polyhydroxybutyrates, and you can see in the tissue here you're getting up to 1 or 2 weight percent of polyester in the plant material. Now the trick there, I think, is to put have the plastic produced in the part of the plant that we typically don't use for food consumption, right? So anytime people sort of bring up the food versus fuel debate, I'm totally, it's a false debate. It's a complete false debate. If you look, I mean, we've always grown plants for both food and fiber, right? And if you think about what we've been able to do with biotechnology in recent years with the cellulosic biorefining, we're able to take cellulose now and enzymatically hydrolyze it to sugars, okay? You can take the sugars from cellulose and run the enzymatic reaction and make high fructose corn syrup, right? So what there is there's carbon. We're carbon life forms, and we need to be smart scientists about how do we actually manipulate carbon through chemistry and biochemistry. But I think we'll eventually be smart enough to feed ourselves with coal, right? Because we need carbon. Why can't you just convert coal into the types of nutrients that we need? When we were in C2B2, I tried to make that argument with Total, where the people are from France, and they completely sneered and said, we can never eat such things. So but they eat snails, yeah, and frog legs too, yeah. Okay, so that's sort of my wide spiel, but I would like to make that sort of final point, really. If you look at this futuristic version of how are we going to get materials and food and fibers, I mean, there really is something going on at the interface of these different types of technologies. And I like to joke, eventually we'll just be able to go out into the field and harvest a medium men's size polo shirt, right? And just pull that out and put it on, get good enough at manipulating things. Okay, so let's return then and talk a little bit about some real work done, real science done in my own group. And as I said, I've been involved with polylactides for a very, very long time, starting in, actually when I first started as an assistant professor at Mines in 1993. And we did a lot of work on rheology. Some of our work actually serves as the quality control methodologies in that plant in Blair, Nebraska. But one of the things that's not so good about polylactide is that it has a relatively low glass transition temperature, and that is that it will soften at around 60 degrees or so. And that's fine if you're making a nice plastic PET-like beer cup, but if you want to have a hot cup of coffee, it's not so good. And so from a polymer science perspective, polymer engineering perspective, chemical engineering perspective, really, it's a lot like metallurgy. It's not just the intrinsic structure of the material, but it's also the path that it takes, right? So there's sort of the analogy between state properties and path properties in thermodynamics. The path by which the material has been processed makes a big difference in its properties. So in metallurgy, there's heat treatment, and in polymer science, there's very similar things. So the way you actually process the material can make a big difference in terms of the final properties that are observed. An obvious one to think about for polymers is just the percent crystallinity. Okay, percent crystallinity is an important parameter, and of course if you draw fiber out, it crystallizes more, so it'll have a greater amount of crystallinity. The other thing we can do is we can add different types of fillers, and so this is an example from the literature here where that issue associated with polylactide has been overcome. This is the heat distortion temperature, sort of like the glass transition temperature, not exactly, but it's essentially the softening point of the material. Depends on things like crystallinity. And here we're looking at it as a function of a loading, and that the particular thing that was used in this case is actually montmorillonite clay. It's been surface functionalized, and it's been surface functionalized in order to give it better compatibility with the polymer so that you can disperse it and mix it together. And the functionality that we used was a quaternary ammonium type of compound. And the problem with that is that those are antimicrobial agents. And so if you imagine putting a polymer that's subject to hydrolytic degradation into a compost pile along with an antimicrobial agent, right? The antimicrobial agent is going to go into your compost and kill your compost, right? So really, really ill-conceived work, in my opinion. But it does show you that you can use nanoscopic fillers to overcome the heat distortion issue. If we check against sort of the principles of green chemistry, what are we really trying to do? So we are using renewable feedstocks for the polymer there, but the clay itself would have to be mined, okay? And so if you can avoid mining your nanoscopic filler, it's preferable that you do that. But more importantly in that particular case is, the number 10 principle is that you want the things to degrade after their useful life is done, but you don't want them to degrade into something that's going to kill people, right? Or it's going to somehow otherwise damage the environment. And so, it's important that they degrade to innocuous substances. And so we were sort of motivated by those principles of green chemistry and, by the idea that, it'd be nice if you could maintain the degradability. And so some number of years ago, we started looking at nanoscopic cellulose. And again, I have some sort of classic old references here. Hermann Mark, one of the giants of polymer science, published a book in 1932, in German about the physical properties of cellulose. We worked really hard in biorefining to overcome the recalcitrance of cellulose. Right? So it's very hard to break cellulose down and digest it into sugars. And exactly what's working against you from the perspective of biorefining works for you in terms of making useful materials. Because these cellulosic nano whiskers, which come about from doing acid hydrolysis, are very tough little pieces of matter. That is that they're high modulus, they're highly crystalline, so they're not subject to water ingression, etc. And they really make for nice materials to look at. And I mentioned the fact that the USDA has an initiative in biomanufacturing. They also have an initiative this year in nanoscopic cellulose. So it's been a topic of some interest in recent years. And I show here, this is sort of the microfibril there. These, upon drying, have sort of agglomerated some.